Hello? Yeah, great. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. If not, you can put on your headsets. Hopefully, everything is technically okay. Welcome to another fantastic side event at the Humanitarian Hub. We have a really interesting lineup of speakers here with us from different parts of the world with different backgrounds. And we are going to discuss a really crucial topic, and that is the nexus of climate change, conflict, and food insecurity. So we are going to Am I audible? Okay, good to know. Sorry. So the official title of the side event is Enhancing Community Resilience Towards the Hunger, Climate, Conflict Nexus. And the side event is co-organized by Action Against Hunger and ADRA. And my name is Abdullah Fahimi. I am a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. I work on climate, on the intersection of climate and foreign policy, with a geographical focus on fragile and conflict-affected settings. I'm really happy and honored to be here moderating this session with a really stellar lineup of speakers. The concept or the idea behind this side event is to discuss and unpack the intersection between climate change and conflict on the one hand, and these two also interact between each other. But today we discuss the intersection between climate change and conflict on the one hand, and how do they exacerbate food insecurity and malnutrition, hunger. So these issues around food insecurity in general. And we will unpack this nexus with local experiences and context-specific interactions based on a paper that was published, I believe, last year by Action Against Hunger. And you can find that paper, which is online. The title is Rapid Assessments of the Hunger, Climate, Conflict Nexus. And it had a geographical focus on Mali, South Sudan, and Somalia. We will first start with short inputs of around 5 minutes by each speaker, and we have a really interesting lineup of speakers. And then, after the short inputs by the speakers, we will go into a discussion, and hopefully at the end, I hope we will have some minutes also to have some questions from the room here, but also we have many people joining us online. We'll have a tool called Slido, which we will then show later during the session. That you can interact, share your impressions, or ask questions. Please do so, engage, and that only adds to the richness of the side event that we already have. So I'm going to first start asking Alvin Munyasia from Action Against Hunger. He has a wealth of knowledge on specifically the region of East and Horn of Africa. He works with the Action Against Hunger and has a good overview of the regional trends. We will start with him, and then we will go on and ask each panelist to provide us with their inputs, initial inputs. So, Alvin, since you have a good overview of the region, of the nexus of climate change, conflict, and food insecurity in East and Horn of Africa. What, can you give us some of the most prominent trends in the region, and what are the impacts?
Thank you very much, and pleased to meet you, esteemed panelists and participants for this particular session on the nexus between climate conflict and hunger. A conversation that is happening at a crucial time when the Horn of Africa had not even recovered from COVID-19, and we slipped into a drought, an unprecedented drought that we have faced in the last 40 years, pushing millions of women and children, especially those living in rural areas and in the front line of conflict, into food insecurity and nutrition security. After the drought, the Horn of Africa experienced unprecedented floods that affected farmlands and communities, and then had an impact of our productive chains, and many farmers faced a lot of losses in terms of their farm produce, and therefore many households were not able to feed themselves, to fend for their children, women, and community at large, because 80% of the African continent primarily depends on rain-fed agriculture, and half of that population are women, and these women are much more responsible of taking care of their households, as well as get involved in economic activities that support local communities to build resilience, as well as ensuring that local markets are able to function in a way that benefits these local communities. And therefore, I also want to join the other African civil society organizations to say that indeed we are a continent of special needs and circumstances, and therefore, as we think of climate action, then we should put the context of the reality of what these countries are facing, including cross-border conflict in the northern corridor between Somalia, Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. In that regard, in partnership with the German Foreign Federal Office, we commissioned a rapid assessment of the impacts of climate change and conflict in Somalia, South Sudan, and Mali. And even as we are having this conversation, I think it's beneficial to bring the world back and refocus their eyes to the forgotten crisis in South Sudan, and the influx of refugees that are coming in from Sudan and returnees, and how that is eroding the gains that already has been made in a country like South Sudan that had not even recovered from conflict, and now host communities and returnees already facing friction in terms of access to natural resources. So in this research and the intersection in the case of Somalia, we looked at El Bade, Bakul region, Baidoa, and Bay. And communities there face a combination of insecurity and armed conflict and a weak state presence, as well as shocks, especially drought combined with flooding. And this one has trapped these communities into a vicious circle, and it is now becoming more apparent across that these disasters of climate indeed is a threat multiplier in that particular context. Secondly, the food and nutrition insecurity is dire in Somalia, and this is because with the lack of access to inputs and access to productive use of resources, then means that communities are not able to access their farmlands to farm, and therefore lack of proper diet that these communities have been used to. Another thing is that because of this conflict, the issue of the missing link and broken market systems therefore has an impact in terms of livelihoods, because then communities are not able to involve themselves in a manner that they were used to in terms of access to these communities. Internal displacement is another impact of climate change, both within and without the borders of these countries, and therefore leading to other impacts like child marriages and gender-based violence that more communities are facing in that regard. So in a nutshell, those were some of the findings that we have from the rapid assessment that we conducted in these countries. Over.
Thank you very much. That was a very good overview to also then hopefully help further discussion, also the inputs by our other panelists. And we will get back to you, Alvin, with follow-up questions. But before that, we move on to Nimo Hassan. Nimo Hassan is the director of the Somalia Consortium and chair of the board of the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, a global network of humanitarian organizations. And she has over 15 years of experience in both humanitarian and development contexts and programming. She is also she has specialized in delivering programs that empower vulnerable people and marginalized communities. Nimo Hassan, from your perspective and based on your work with national NGOs, how do you see their role in responding to climate and conflict-induced hunger?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I actually wear many hats, and thank you for giving that introduction. But here in this panel, I'll be talking about the role of the local NGOs in responding to the food hunger, especially in Somalia. Despite the enormous challenges presented by the context, national NGOs have been delivering nutrition services to high standards in emergency and non-emergency settings for many, many years. National NGOs, as we all know, and as we all say in conversations like this, know better than the INGOs or the UN or the donors or internal experts what the situation is like on the ground. The details and the nuisance of across Somalia's landscape, because they are on the front lines, they are part and parcel of the community. National NGOs, like all of us, can always benefit from technical capacity building, but given the qualification, knowledge and experience they bring to the table, they should be treated as a full partner in fighting against hunger. On the issue of food security, conflict and climate, in line with the messages from the previous panelists, conflict and climate change have contributed to the erosion, not only at the country level or the community level, but the household level. Their ability to withstand and have resilience has completely weakened over the years because of these multiple shocks and without having a decent time to recover. Around 63% of children in Somalia have experienced severe food poverty in their early childhood, making them up to 50% more likely to experience wasting, a life-threatening form of malnutrition. I would like to quote my sister, Wafa Saeed, who is the representative of UNICEF. She said, child food poverty is a serious issue in Somalia that has been compounded by the cycle of climate-induced crisis and conflicts. It makes children vulnerable to both chronic as well as a severe malnutrition. 1.6 million children under the age of 5 are high risk of acute malnutrition, while approximately 400,000 are facing severe acute malnutrition. The number of people who will face acute food insecurity is projected to reach 4.4 million due to below average rainfall and the looming La Nina phenomena. National NGOs work in settings with intensified food insecurity because of the effects of climate change and conflict shocks on existing vulnerabilities such as poverty and displacement. Somalia is 100% dependent on wheat imports, making supply chain routes essential. Conflict also affects the production of essential food, especially attacks on markets, which affect the quantity and the quality of available food, including prices as well. 10% of all recorded airstrikes, piloted and drone aircraft in Somalia in 2017 and 2022 had direct impact on food security by damaging or destroying assets used for food production and distribution. Limiting access to food and water, for example, the destruction of water infrastructure has been used as a Al-Shabaab conflict tactic. Conflict causes displacement of millions, separating people from their normal supply chains. So, as you can see, the impacts of this conflict, the recurrent cycle of climate shock, the impact completely either destroys or weakens the community's ability to withstand these shocks. Now, some of the challenges you've asked me about for local partners are often national NGOs are often tasked with important, sometimes life-saving deliverables on nutrition in extremely low resource and low capacity settings. Food security and food sufficiency and nutrition for the general population require multiple functional systems working in tandem. The development and humanitarian community task national NGOs with delivering nutrition supplies and knowledge to communities, along with critical care to children under 5, pregnant and lactating women, and other vulnerable groups. With risks of violence, kidnapping and looting operationally making it extremely difficult for national NGOs to deliver, even when INGOs sometimes deem unsafe. Access becomes really problematic, so we need a system which supports them, enables them to deliver food and nutrition to communities as well. And I think a lot of these compounding issues not only transfer the risk to the national NGOs, but they do need to become a full and to be seen a full member, a full partner to deliver and respond to the food insecurity that is exacerbated by climate and conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nimo, on explaining the role that local NGOs can play, and also how can they be better supported. Maybe that you can share more later about what can be done to increase their capacity so that they can respond better. Now we move on to Karina Rolli, and she is the ADRA's climate policy advisor. Karina focuses on international climate finance at the intersection of humanitarian assistance, while supporting the global ADRA network with offices in 122 countries with policy engagement and funding diversification. She's led initiatives that bridge a gap between humanitarian needs and sustainable financing. Karina is also known for working for crafting cross-sectoral partnerships and implementing funding models that support sustainable development and resilience in the face of climate change. So very relevant experience that Karina brings to this session. My question to Karina is how can the evidence that Alvin and Nemo has shared from both the research that has been done and published last year, but also from their experience. How can this evidence and experience help us to inform UNFCCC processes, and how can they contribute to change at the UNFCCC level? Karina?
Thank you so much, Abdullah. It's certainly an honor and a pleasure to be on this panel with so many esteemed speakers. And I mean, in the humanitarian space, we've had the discussion now for already a couple of years that the lived realities of the communities on the ground, when we don't have integrated approaches and we do not recognize the intersections between certain areas of action, hunger, conflict, and so on and so forth, it doesn't work. So in order to make approaches more sustainable, in order to make the humanitarian assistance system effective and fit for purpose, the nexus is very, very important. Climate is a threat multiplier. When we look at any kind of vulnerability, it doesn't matter if we're talking about gender, if we're talking about disability, children's rights, education, it is always a threat multiplier. And the nexus can help us inform this, and the evidence out of the nexus can also help inform UNFCCC processes. And this is why it's so important to take the evidence from the ground and feed them into exactly these processes, also here at COP29. So for example, the rapid assessment that has been done with ACF and funded by the GFFO is one very important tool to actually say this is what's happening on the ground and this is what we can actually do. There is a nexus. We have to look at climate finance in the way that it is also fit for purpose for conflict settings. Now, when we look at climate finance in general, what we're seeing is that it is infamously risk averse, and that is a problem because when we talk about conflict areas, then anyway, climate finance that is carried largely by private investment is to be seen critical because we also need to talk about grants instead of like private investment or loans and so on and so forth. But it has to be, there has to be a conflict sensitivity in the international climate finance architecture in order to be able to tackle the problems that we're facing. So this is very, very important. This is what we're fighting for. Now, looking at the climate finance COP, I mean, for everyone who's been following the discussions, we know it's extremely frustrating. The discussions on the NCQG is stalling. As long as the discussions on the global financing goal is stalling, nothing is moving forward. And that also means that loss and damage isn't moving forward. And this is something that is important. This is something that civil society has been fighting for a decade. And it's good that we have the fund, but the money needs to flow. The money needs to reach the communities that need them. And unless that money flows, it is still not a success. So that means within the NCQG, we cannot give up that there is an explicit sub-goal for loss and damage, and that there is a reliable funding mechanism over the years for fragile states, for communities that are in a vulnerable situation to be able to be, to get like the finances that they need in order to build resilience and combat sudden onset climate catastrophes, for example. This is very, very important. And also, it has to be accessible, of course, also for humanitarian actors and frontline communities. This is important. We have to also talk about accessibility, trackability of the finance. This will be our job as climate advocates in the next years to make sure that this is granted, and we have to hold the negotiators accountable for that. And I want to maybe end with one thing that, I always hear like forgotten crisis, and it is true, they are forgotten, but we also have to think about forgotten by whom, like who forgets these crises? It's not the people on the ground that are forgetting this crisis. They're living through the realities every single day. So I really stress the point that the so-called forgotten crises, they cannot be forgotten by the international climate finance architecture.
Thank you very much. Also for ending on a very strong point and case for not forgetting some of the contexts that are usually, unfortunately, forgotten. And also, Karina, thank you for making the point on an integrated approach, a nexus approach, that all of these problems also need to be considered as a nexus, that one leads or contributes to the other. And that also nicely leads us to the last input, because Dr. Because Dr. Martin Frick has many years of experience working at different organizations, and he can tell us more about how organizations such as UN bodies, but also other processes, can integrate and go with an integrated and nexus approach. Dr. Martin Frick is the director of the World Food Program Office for Germany, Austria, and Liechtenstein since November 2021. He has worked as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Food Systems Summit 2021 and also as Executive Director of the UNFCCC Secretariat, which oversees the implementation of the Paris Agreement. He has also helped to develop the climate justice narrative as the climate director of the Food and Agriculture organization, and later as program director of the Kofi Annan Foundation. Also, Dr. Frick has been a German ambassador to the United Nations in Bonn, and contributed to the founding of the UN's Sustainability Hub. We are very happy to have you here. The question that I would like to put to you here is based on the point Karina and most recently Karina, but also Nimo and Alvin have been making. How do you think the humanitarian system can be arranged such that they are better prepared to now respond to all of these problems, the three problems: the hunger, climate change, and conflict. And we know that more and more humanitarian organizations are unfortunately required to also to respond to climate-related events. So that's our question. How can the humanitarian system in general be designed to be able to respond better?
Maybe I start on a very provocative note. The answer is simply they cannot. They cannot. WFP is 60% underfunded. In the 60th year of its existence, we have seen how the numbers of extremely hungry people have been going up from 135 million in 2019 to over 300 million people in 2024. That is a screaming scandal, and we cannot say it loud enough. We have more than 300 million people on this planet who don't know where the next meal is coming from, who are skipping their meals in order for the kids to have something to eat. We mentioned the climate justice here, and this is a core issue of climate justice, because people who are living in fragile contexts are really the hardest hit by climate change. And if you look at fragile situation, fragile more often than not means politically fragile, means societally fragile, and means environmentally fragile. Look at the map that many years ago UNCCD, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, has published. And if you look at the countries that are most affected by desertification and climate impacts, it looks almost like the same map of countries that are in conflict worldwide. That number was never as big since the Second World War as currently. We have 59 live conflicts. And you see that in Sudan, and it was mentioned by our friends on the panel, how people are suffering from the impact of the fighting, how it's compounded by the environmental degradation. And mind you, I'm not only talking about climate change, I'm talking about decades mismanagement of land, of areas where you don't see a tree in a wide area, where groundwater has disappeared, where basic needs are not there. Now, how can the humanitarian community better prepared? It's a tough one, because you are between a rock and a hard stone. You're underfunded and you're facing the toughest crises that are out there. There are instruments. You can be more efficient in humanitarian aid by front-loading, by basically ensuring that money is already there before a disaster hits, when we know that a dry spell is coming, when we know that there is extreme rainfall. We can hand out money to people right away. And we are working there very closely with civil society and the local population because it has been said very eloquently, the people on the ground know best. And if you want to know how to assist the people on the ground, give them a voice, go there. Don't sit in a capital city and, listen to broadcasting. Go there and talk to the people. And so that is what we do. We can try and work with insurance schemes. But you see my reluctance when I'm saying that, because we are paying, as Al Gore has said it, for an insurance where we know that the damaging event will be happening. So the unpredictable, the natural impact, or should I better say the man-made impacts, because it is climate change, become the predictable. So in the nexus, what I see very strongly is we need to join forces, we need to integrate, we need to understand that rebuilding nature capital, restoring land, bringing water tables up, giving people a possibility to farm and to build livelihoods is essential. Peace is essential, and it's on two sides. You cannot build up anything when live fighting is going on. So we need diplomatic initiatives, particularly in the so-called forgotten crisis. We need to ensure that people are not being robbed for power games, and that we are not seeing proxy wars on the costs of people who live on the ground. If you combine that, you can also switch it over and say, when you restore the land, when people can go farm again, when they have access to their markets, then there is a perspective of building peace and building lasting peace. So the entire international community is really challenged here to come much closer together. I see this happening, and that is actually in all doom and gloom in this COP something that makes me quite happy. People speak about people in fragile contexts, people speak about food systems all over the place, and finally we come to the simple recognition that people have to eat. I was joking on another panel and saying people talking about the importance of food and food systems is like people talking about the importance of breathing. You drop dead if you don't. So it's pretty straightforward. Last sentence, I think with an approach from food and from food system, localized, on the ground, you really have a tool at hand to actually manage this complicated interdependence, because as hunger is the last consequence when everything else fails, starting with hunger helps you to get the most basic things right in order to build up a society and to build up the environment that carries that society.
Thank you very much. Now we have had inputs from all of our speakers, and this is now the part where you can also get involved in the discussion. We have, as I announced in the beginning, we have a tool called Slido, and you can join the discussion here. You can use the QR code and the code that's up there to share your thoughts, your impressions of what our speakers have been sharing with us, but also questions. And also to the speakers, I also encourage you to react to one another's comments if you want to, but we also have questions for you, also probably questions coming online. I would like to go first to Alvin. Alvin made a point about the vicious cycle of climate change leading to conflict through either food insecurity or other pathways. There has been research on this for the past decade or so. While the research has been growing, the body of literature on this has grown a lot over the past 10 or 15 years, let's say. But this issue has not been mainstreamed in policy processes that you tackle or address climate change, conflict, and food insecurity also institutionally and formal processes. My question to you, Alvin, is how do we move from this vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle where climate action can lead to peace And what are the opportunities if you look at the region in Eastern and the Horn of Africa, what can be done so that with action on climate, you could also contribute to peace building and the resilience of the communities?
Thank you. And I think Dr. Fik had already eloquently articulated that humanitarian response only or emergency response only cannot help build resilient communities. And the triple nexus gives us an opportunity where we can have a multi-sectoral program that is humanitarian development peace, because even though the Horn of Africa has or is experiencing conflict in particular certain regions, but there are some pockets of peace where we can bring on board communities as well as other entities that are working on peace building and have programs in a way that are sustainable in nature, working with donors to say this is a model that we can leverage on and ensure that we have sustainable programming on issues to do with food security and livelihood. The policy environment exists. The policy framework is there on how Africa negotiates with other global entities. We have the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program. And these countries can look back internally to say, within this particular framework in our budgeting process, how do we honor and domesticate this policy framework, which they agreed that 10% of their national budgets should be invested in food security, in agriculture. Therefore, a dollar can unlock another dollar from other entities, and therefore building resilient economies and markets together working with peace actors. This conversation is also happening at a crucial time where countries are revising their national determined contribution and climate action that is conflict sensitive is also an opportunity for us to say, in the revision of these NDCs, how do we bring community leaders to the decision-making table, peace actors, local NGOs, and unpack this localization agenda to say local communities with local solutions to local problems understand the context in which they are operating in. How could we employ and leverage indigenous knowledge to ensure that we respond to these calamities? It is a climate finance scope. We need to have a conversation at global level to fix this international financial architecture to ensure that with the increasing humanitarian needs and decreasing humanitarian resources, is there a way that we can scale up humanitarian diplomacy and to find a way how this one meets climate diplomacy in the context of climate finance so that we can unlock it for those that need it. The Africa Development Bank, I have been following their conversation on how they have been encouraging the continent in taking advantage of the bulging youth population in the Horn of Africa, and I know that most of these young people are the ones that are involved or sort of hoodwinked or attracted into participating in these conflict activities, and it's not a demographic dividend if we are not going to invest in these young people in a way that they see value, especially in the agricultural value chain. So having young people at the decision making table should then help the whole of continent to participate in the agriculture sector, not as a development activity, but rather approach agriculture as a business, and therefore work with young people to ensure that we have a peaceful society one that would help us address the root causes of hunger. Early warning systems are very, very important for communities on the front line, accompanied by capacity building and technological know-how to ensure that these local communities are aware of what is ahead of us in terms of natural disasters, so that we are well prepared and we are not reactive to these natural disasters and climate events. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Alvin, and thank you for also highlighting the role of local people, also local solutions, generally local, going local. I have actually many questions noted for all of you, but we also see that there is quite some interest in our side event in the discussion that we've been having, and there are already 7 questions. I will take the first question that I see, and actually this also really is perfect for what Nemo already shared in her initial input about the local NGOs, and she comes from a consortium of NGOs. So if we talk about specifically the role of women and local NGOs or women-led NGOs in the region, how do you, the question is from Anonymous, so no name, question to how do you empower grassroots women in building resilient communities? Well, I just noticed that this is to Dr. Martin Frick, but I think you coming from the NGO consortium, you're also very well placed to take this question.
Sure. I will leave room for Doctor to also come in as well. Okay. Maybe I think what I will do is just start with the role NGOs can play as a whole. I mean, there are minorities within the minorities, and women-led organizations are among those minorities who don't usually get access to the funding and the support. I like the fact that you said we need to unpack the localization agenda. We certainly need to unpack the localization agenda on where we place the most important aspect and where we need to build systems. And I think it has to be within the community level as well, and those who are better placed to serve the communities, including women-led organizations. We need to be intentional in supporting those organizations who are active within their communities. When there's a natural disaster or man-made disaster, it's usually the community who organize themselves to respond. So they are the first responders. And I think we have to be intentional on who we partner with. But those partnerships need to be equitable partners. They need to be equal partners to the table. We can no longer afford to utilize or see local partners as an entity where risk is transferred, an entity where we use when we cannot access or we deem unsafe for INGOs or donors to access communities. They have to be strategic, they have to be equal partners, and they have to be given the resources to be able to deliver equitably to the community so that we are building food systems, integrated approaches to problems which are not separated or siloed. The problems are multi-faced, therefore our approach has to be multi-faced as well. So then intentionally looking at the minority rights organizations, looking at the people with disability organizations, look at with the women networks. And SNC, the Somali NGO Consortium, can act as a connector, to connect the international partners with the local partners. We have many diverse organizations. So I think the way we approach, the way we design has to change, especially, I know the resources for humanitarian support is actually globally declining. This also will give us an opportunity, I think, to innovate in the way we do business as humanitarians, and continue to advocate to do and get the development and climate finance into these organizations, into these countries and these communities as well. So I would encourage and I will call for all of us to see the diminishing resources as a way to innovate, to tighten our belts, to ensure that we are more efficient and that we're reaching the communities directly as possible, but ensuring that we are seeing local partners and local civil society and grassroots organizations as the way to reach the communities more equitably and looking at the long term as well. I think I'll leave it here and let you come in that.
Maybe
Do you want to? Yeah.
Yes, maybe very briefly. First of all, I set my signature under what you just said. Wonderful, I agree with it absolutely. Let's briefly touch on the two difficulties I'm seeing here. Communicating to donors, there is a push for more localization, which is a very good thing, and it is a function also of the Great Bargain. But sometimes I don't see the same readiness and risk appetite to go down to the level. And that makes it for UN organizations sometimes a bit tricky, because if anything should be going wrong, you stand responsible for that. So risk sharing and a higher risk appetite in difficult situations, I think would help. And the second bit is, more often than not, you have different funding sources when it comes to humanitarian aid or what is labeled development or resilience work. And while that in the community is an organic process where you do both at the same time, when it comes to the money, sometimes it's not easy to actually say we spend this on the humanitarian and that on the resilience side, and that is neatly separated. But when it comes from different funding sources, from different ministries, and you're reporting to the national parliament and the budget committee, you need to bring that clarity. And so sometimes the reality in an OECD country donating money and having plans is very different from the reality that you have on the ground, trying to fight a crisis and trying to support the local population.
Thank you very much. As you can see, we have 9 questions, but somehow I cannot move down the list. But anyway, if you in the room are interested or have already posed the questions, of course, for better human interaction, you can also, yeah?
Sorry,
Yes.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I would actually like to react to one of the things on the screen if I could.
For sure, no, for sure. I was coming to you, but yeah, please take a question which you want to answer. But before that, if you want to ask your question or share your thoughts from here, because you've made the effort to come here, so we give, of course, we're very happy. Yeah. After Karina's answer, then we will come to the questions in the room. Karina, which question do you want to take?
I'll make it short. It's about how communities affected can be directly compensated by those exploiting them, especially through the natural resources. I actually don't have an answer to that, but I do want to say that in the climate and humanitarian space, and maybe we can add biodiversity in there as well, because biodiversity is a local issue and the exploitation of natural resources is connected to this topic. I think in this two-way conversation, we have to do one thing. So like climate action, climate policymakers need to be informed more about the humanitarian experience, about anticipatory action, and especially about do no harm. That's one thing. And do no harm, at ADRA actually we started a new project where we're looking at do no environmental harm. So we're looking at supply chain management, we're looking at carbon accounting, because sometimes the projects that we do, and then we leave the area again, does have degrading effects on natural resources, and that being the basis for the livelihoods of the people on the ground, we just need to be a bit more aware that this also poses a risk. So do no environmental harm, informing humanitarian perspectives in the climate action, and then it also goes the other way around. Like So, like more greener humanitarian action and more humanitarian climate response. This, I think, is very, very important. I don't know how the compensation would work with that, but we definitely have to be a bit more aware, and we have to get more knowledge on how to act in certain fragile contexts. And for this, there are tools out there, for example, the NEET Plus and so on. And I actually urge donors to take that more on their agenda. This has to be one of the requirements that humanitarian organizations also understand how do no environmental harm works. This is not about burdening humanitarian actors further, because we all know we have a broad portfolio that we have to cover, and every time there's a new indicator that we have to follow. But this is really about making sure that we don't create more harm when we actually respond to disasters.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Also, especially your remark on how the climate people. I come from the climate bubble. How we could learn from humanitarian sector who've been doing this work for years, especially in the fragile and conflict-affected settings. So we now go to the room here. I think there were 3 people. You were first, and then you were the second. Could you please?
And yeah, thank you and very much. And my name is Ibrahim, and I am representing a marginalized and led organization. And one of the success story that I wanted to share, and what Nimo has been said, and this is why, and we have very key important in terms of us representing this high level meeting is an initiative and inspiration that is practically done by NGO consortium. And this is one of the practical success stories that I wanted to share with you all. In terms of the question that I might be going to have asked, similarly to all partners, to all panelists, what specific strategies or programs have proven most effective in building communities' resilience to interconnected issues of hunger, climate change, and conflict? And how can this be scaled up to influence systematical policy change for all program-related matters?
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. And we will collect another question from you, and then we will go back to our panels.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My name is Farah Osman from Somalia. I work with Plan International. And my question is, these shocks have been recurrent in all over the world. And the phenomenon of the shocks have been changing. So do we have research? Do we have lessons learned in terms of the shocks that can be best, that have been documented, that can be presented, and that will be evidence-based in terms of the programming? Or we are talking about repeating the same thing every now and then in terms of the response of the climate change? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim and Osman, if I remember correctly. So you all heard the really relevant questions, and I would like to now turn to the panelists. Whoever wants to take a go at any of the questions. So just to remind you the questions, Ibrahim was curious about what successful strategies in programs concretely do you know of, and how could they be scaled up? And then Osman was asking about what are the lessons learned from responding to shocks, previous shocks, and how can we avoid these in the future? Anyone?
That is a good question, and policy change is a long process. It's not an event. And from our multi-sectoral approach implementation of programs, I would bring in the example of Ethiopia, where we have a strategic partnership with the government of Ethiopia and help them come up with a policy that looks into water and sanitation, food security and livelihood, as well as nutrition, and bringing in the peace element and working together globally in ensuring that we work with the different and specific entities within the borders in implementing international humanitarian law, Resolution 2417, and ensuring that humanitarian actors and humanitarian aid is respected for us to deliver these services and ensure that it reaches those communities in the front line of conflict and climate change.
Anyone else wants to react, answer to the questions? Dr. Frick?
I understand both questions as a bit of what are the best practices, what have we learned? And I think one thing that we do have learned is to start with the community. When I'm speaking with about anticipatory humanitarian action, this includes early on a conversation with all of the community about trigger points. When are we paying out? And the community knows that we don't have much money to pay out. So we need to choose a trigger point where the money makes a difference and is really needed. And in these discussions, you already find that the community reflects on the own vulnerability, takes measures to reduce the vulnerability. So even the approach itself, without any disaster involved, is already helping raising the awareness and the cooperation of the community. And so I believe that any approach to reduce the vulnerability of communities has to start with the community, and you said it very eloquently, and has to include the natural system, because it's very simple. The poorer you are, the more you depend directly on nature. So if nature is broken, so is the community.
Karina?
And maybe just adding on to that, I think that there is a lot of data available already. Not sufficient. I don't think much is tracked, but there is sufficient data available. And I think it's not always about data. I mean, we just presented a survey also about, done by ACF. It's really about political will. So we need to do something with the data. And within the policy scopes, we have to look at funding mechanisms. They have to be more flexible. We have to look at anticipatory action, disaster risk reduction. It is 6 times more expensive to respond to a crisis after it has happened. If we know that there are recurring crises, why aren't we there already? And I think also the humanitarian space needs to get a little bit out of the damage control mindset. We need to go before the crisis. That's with the funding mechanisms. That's how we react to crisis. But it's also about the policies on state level, on local level, on regional level. And this is very important. So we have to highlight political will. And I think COP is one of the areas where we can do that.
Thank you very much. And we've had almost all of our speakers respond to the questions. And that leaves us with Nemo. And then we will wrap up after Nemo's remarks.
Just quickly, I agree with all the points that have been raised by my panelists, and I just wanted to underline the issue that you raised, Dr. Michael, on the risk and the risk awareness of the donors. And I think if we really do need, if we want to meet the ground bargain, there's a lot of signatories to the ground bargain. We have to change policies to enable and facilitate for that localization agenda to take place. That includes the risk sharing. That includes that political will you were talking about. That includes seeing local partners not only as an entities to use where there isn't, to deliver services where there isn't access to by international organizations, but really an equitable and a key player to change the situation of the vulnerable and affected communities that we're trying to serve. So for me, sometimes we make these political, ambitious, sensational commitments that really we need to see through delivered by putting the mechanisms in place so that we are having a positive impact and change to communities' lives. That we're talking about matter of livelihoods lost, we're talking about matter of lives lost at the community level. And internationally, that action and that energy that we speak when we're having conversations need to materialize into policy change. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's a good message for us to take with us and hopefully also encourage and convince policymakers We've had a really interesting and lively discussion on the nexus of conflict, climate change, and food insecurity. Thank you very much for coming here in the room and also tuning in online. We've discussed resilience of communities, protecting natural resources, mainstreaming this nexus approach in policy processes. We've been talking about the need for flexible funding, localization agenda, and also risk sharing. And really also very relevant questions raised here in the room. We also have our one-word takeaways, which really also reflect what we've been discussing here. Action, community, peace. Thank you very much for all to all our panelists and also to you for coming here. Please give a round of applause to our panelists who've made the time to come here and share their thoughts with us.